Hello, and welcome to the discussion about the path forward for the Navy and cyber risk. As many of you know, as evidenced by the fact that you are here today listening to this, that the Navy is moving towards a point where everybody pays more attention to cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk. When the CNO brought out his FRAGO, he specifically directed commanders to make cybersecurity part of our DNA. And that's oftentimes easier said than done. But that message has been heard, and we're moving out as best as we can to implement the CNO's guidance. Within OPNAV N2 and 6, we're looking to implement a new Navy cyber normal. What this means is that we have a reduced cyber risk to mission. This is increased senior leadership and fleet involvement in reducing the cyber risk to mission, and also identifying what that risk is and helping to communicate that more effectively. This is a broader scope of what risk has traditionally been, not just risk to system or risk to DOTAN, but also specifically to the risk of all of the missions that that system is supporting. And that means that commanders own the cyber risk. They need to know what it is. They need to understand the fundamental concepts of cyber risk and then how that affects their unit's cyber readiness posture. They need to know how their platforms will perform in a cyber contested environment in the same way that they would know how their platforms will perform in a traditional military combat situation. And then finally, that transitions us over into direct measurements of risk. What we want to be doing is focusing on quantitative risk assessments, specifically focusing on the threats, abilities, and impact, and moving to real-time monitoring to the greatest extent possible. Now, this can be something of a challenge when we deal with air-gapped systems, and so we don't necessarily need to know what that system is doing here and now to understand a real-time assessment of risk for that system. In that if we have good models, if we have good data about how that system is architected, then the real-time threat data coming in gives us a real-time risk posture for that system as well, even if the system is air-gapped. And we'll talk more about that as time progresses. So without further ado, we'll move right into it. What are we here today talking about? A quantitative cyber risk assessment Pathfinder initiative. A lot of initiatives going on right now, and what our focus is really going to be on is distilling all of those different efforts down into a single Pathfinder, and that enables us to scope to a single program, making sure that it works for that program, focus all of that time and energy and resources on a single application instead of trying to solve world hunger on day one. And what that's going to do is it's going to help us to refine and validate a lot of the procedures that are already in place for both quantitative cyber risk assessments and then also agile and continuous monitoring. Why are we here? A lot of the people will ask, what's the purpose of a quantitative cyber risk assessment? Or sometimes they'll say, well, we're already doing that. Or sometimes the discussion kind of turns to, well, we don't really need that. We already have a process in place. So really the focus here is that when we start talking about risk cube analysis, specifically those ordinal scales, low, medium, high, very low, those are ordinal scales. The same type of low fidelity numerical system that you might do for like a pain scale. There's a lot of challenges with that, and that they are not very strong mathematically. It becomes very difficult to aggregate. There's not a good way to articulate uncertainty, and that gives us a whole slew of other follow-on issues. Really, the risk cube analysis, as a result of some of those fundamental issues and the fact that it's a matrix instead of a numerical value, is that it fails to enable commanders to make risk-informed decisions. We can present risk data to them, but because of the difficulty in aggregating, if I present the commanders 15 different risk matrices and tell them to figure out overall what that risk is, it becomes very difficult for them to decide because of the aggregation issues. And also, it fails to articulate cyber resiliency and how it changes over time. It's good that we're doing these risk assessments in the risk matrix, but we don't know necessarily from looking at this how that values will change over time. What is a 5% reduction of a medium? So if I know that my risk posture degrades by 5% a year, it becomes very difficult to articulate that in this risk matrix. Additionally, it fails to identify the totality of risk factors present for the system. Because risk assessments are often system focused and limited to a single application, when I take that system and apply it to multiple different applications, it becomes very difficult to translate those risk assessments over into those new applications. Or when there are risk factors that are external to the system, it becomes very difficult to incorporate that data as well. These risk cubes also lack traceability in that if I, at a later date, gain new data which modifies my risk assessment, because I don't have traceability back into the factors that were considered at the time of the risk assessment was done, the original risk assessment then becomes less and less valuable as new data comes in because of that lack of traceability. When we can move to a quantitative measure, then we can actually trace to what the assumptions were made in the beginning and then continue to refine those assumptions over time based on new data. So that traceability is going to be key as we continue with continuous monitoring and continuous updates. And then the last thing is that it fails to integrate mission risk assessments. And that mission risk oftentimes comes at a later portion in the acquisition once multiple different systems have been aggregated in together. And it becomes very difficult to do these risk assessments at a later date, building upon the risk assessments that were done earlier on in that acquisition. And then oftentimes when we start talking about ATO specifically, there is no requirement for a mission risk assessment prior to issuing an ATO. Next is it fails to incorporate uncertainty in assessments. We mentioned this before. If I'm making an assessment of risk and I have a large amount of uncertainty incorporated, a lot of times what will happen is we will select a worst case scenario. Saying, hey, this can be anywhere between very low and very high, and so because I don't know where it's going to fall on there, I'm just going to say it's very high. Well, the challenge is that I'm going to say everything is very high, and you start meaning nothing very quickly. When we start moving to quantitative risk assessments, we can actually start including that uncertainty, and that the very low to very high range is my uncertainty, and I can start looking specifically to test and to add additional value to be able to reduce the range of possible probable outcomes. Risk cubes currently don't have that ability. And next, we oftentimes fail to accurately identify probability. And this kind of touches on what we were just talking about, right? What is possible versus what is probable? It's possible this thing can happen, but just because it's possible doesn't necessarily mean that it's probable. It's possible that in the next 10 years that the world will get hit by a meteor, but we all know that that's unlikely to happen. It's low probable, and so we're not all preparing our lives based upon the possibility that we could be hit by a meteor because we know that the probability is very low. So making a distinction between possible and probable is absolutely key. And a lot of that ties also in with the bias effects, where we have, for example, an availability bias, where if we can easily recall an instance where something happened, then I believe that it's more probable. If I can't recall something, then I believe it's lower probability. So this gets into an issue where when you have people who work in the cybersecurity sector and they're constantly being bombarded with these vulnerabilities and instances of hacks and other types of malicious activity, they can easily recall an instance where something has happened, and so then they will say the probability is much higher. But then there will be an argument with somebody else who doesn't have access to that threat data, because they lack classification or whatever else, and then they will say, oh, I can't recall anything, so the probability will be low. Anybody who's done a risk assessment has probably experienced some of those circumstances where you say, oh, you have two different people who have different data behind them, and they're on opposite ends of that spectrum of probabilities. And then the last one is very labor intensive and slow, because we don't have a good way of aggregating everyone's risk assessments in together and being able to articulate that uncertainty. It becomes very difficult to kludge all that data in together and come up with a meaningful result. So that takes a lot of time, a lot of deliberation. And at the end of the day, putting it into a risk matrix, we lose a lot of the fidelity that was present in those discussions. I have included in there a quote down at the bottom from the NIST SP 800 Tech 37. We are seeing a big groundswell movement to move more towards quantitative risk assessments as a general rule. Every time you see the word metrics, you're looking at measurement of risk, measurement of risk factors. We're going to see this crop up over and over again in the coming years. So why are we here today specifically? This is the Quantitative Cyber Risk Assessment Initiative objective. It's really just one objective, and that is to validate quantitative methods to improve a commander's risk-informed decision-making during mission execution. And so what we oftentimes have been previously talking about is the Fleet Cyber Command mission, where you're ensuring freedom of action across all the Navy's warfighting domains in, through, and from cyberspace. And so that's our traditional view of cybersecurity, our traditional risk mission, the FCC mission, which is I want to make sure that I can operate freely in cyberspace. But there's also the Navy's mission as a broader brushstroke, which is really to talk about winning conflicts and wars while maintaining security and deterrence through sustained forward presence. So anytime where our ability to execute that mission is threatened due to a loss of control from cyberspace, that will affect the Navy's mission. So what we really want to be doing is, as we start talking about ATOs, we want to start taking not just the FCC mission, but all of the Navy's mission, not just focusing on the cyberspace, but also how does cyberspace affect other missions that the Navy is tasked to do. So for this QCRA specifically, we look at 3 primary supporting objectives. The first one is to develop fundamental QCRA methodology. This is the science aspect. And the thing about science is that it can apply to a whole bunch of different applications. So a lot of different system types, many different processes, RMF, TNE, different points of the acquisition cycle. We're talking about fundamental. How do I do quantitative cyber risk assessments? The second one is we want to validate that methodology with an actual system. We want to look at identifying that pathfinder and go through the motions and actually result in an ATO for that system using this new methodology. And then specifically, once we're complete here, we want to be in posture to where we can do continuous monitoring after that. Right? What is the role of the red teams? What is the role of a dashboard? What is the role of automated scripts, bug bounties, all of those things that are a part of a healthy continuous monitoring process? And then specifically looking at what are the quantitative outputs and how do those feed back into the original risk assessments in the real-time process. So all of that will be developed as part of the Pathfinder initiative, and we'll talk a little bit more about the scheduling. So for the stakeholders, as you can see, the number of folks who are interested in improving our cybersecurity posture is vast. For the purposes of this Pathfinder, we're going to be looking at a lot of diversity, but trying to scope things down into as much as we can to a specific problem set. But we do have, with the current list of stakeholders, multiple different echelons, OPNAV, SysComs, component commands, warfare centers, and many other interested parties. We have a joint perspective. We have some personnel from Marine Corps, from the Air Force, the Joint AI Center, a variety of different focus areas, RMF, test and evaluation. We have developers on the business systems and combat systems. This is a broad interest area for a lot of different personnel. And then as we continue to move forward, what we're doing is dividing up, because there's a lot of different aspects to this problem. We have 5 different tracks, and these tracks are available to have discussions on. We have a SharePoint portal, and then also during COVID, we have the Microsoft Teams page set up as well. These are public spaces. As long as you have access to those portals, you can look us up and you can engage in the chat and the discussion, the wikis, and all those conversations and files are all there as well. So these tracks are helping us to kind of really focus in on those specific problems. So the first one is going to learn about and validate QCRA implementation. This is your science piece. The second one is to develop agile and continuous QCRA approach. To have the science, how do I continuously engage? That's going to be looking at a lot of the process and how do we actually implement this. The third one is developing metrics and automation standards. Thing is that there's already a lot of tools, there's already a lot of metrics already out there, but because the standards that we have are not specifically tailored to risk assessments, we are not 100% clear at this point about which of those metrics and standards are currently applicable to quantitative cyber risk assessment. And so what we want to do is develop those standards, develop those requirements, so that way it helps us with an analysis of alternatives to identify which tools are already out there, and then what's the delta, what else do we need to fund or develop moving forward. The fourth one is to integrate the warfighting and warfighter requirements. Now, we want to make sure that we're not just looking at this from an acquisition standpoint, but also what is the risk to mission, and what does that look like, and how do we incorporate the warfighting and warfighter. And then the last one is integrating DevSecOps and systems engineering requirements. So we all understand that at the end of the day, these systems are all being developed by somebody, and how do we make sure that we are incorporating the results of these quantitative cyber risk assessments into those developmental processes? How does it incorporate back into DevSecOps? How do they build that feedback loop? In the systems engineering, how does that feedback loop look? And in all cases, we want to make sure that we are leveraging and incorporating work. And this kind of aligns well with the RMF's intent, right? A dynamic and flexible approach that enables us really to not just go with the linear steps 1 through 6 that currently exist inside of RMF, or the structures that are inside the T&E side, but really being able to look at the fundamentals and do what makes sense based on the application. So what are our deliverables? We're really looking at 2 different phases here. So we are currently in phase 1, planning and process development. This is going to be focusing right now on the Pathfinder charter approval. Charter is going to be your official documentation that's going to get all of the stakeholders, the principal stakeholders, to sign off. And when I say principal stakeholders, we're talking about the ones that we require their authorities in order to move forward. So this is going to be whoever the Pathfinder system is going to be, as well as OpNav and potentially others as well. So having that is going to give us a lot more flexibility to move forward and actually get this work done, because now we have support from our leadership. This is the direction that we've already been pushing inside of OpNav, so we know we have support there. And then also looking at OpNav's Echelon 2 executive agent. So as this is an OpNav initiative, what we want to do is whoever the Pathfinder is going to be at the Echelon 2 level will be then designated as the executive agent. And as they're moving forward, they're solving the Echelon 2 problem set, but they're also broadening up a little bit to make sure that the results of the ESH2 work is also applicable to the rest of the Navy. So moving on from the charter that which defines the scope and the stakeholders for our initiative, then we'll have an authorized test plan, which will then enable us to widely communicate what it is that we're looking to do. We are notionally looking at using NAVAIR, which is why we have NAVAIR standard work package, although for any of the SysComs that may be involved, this could be any procedure. Really what you're looking at is what is the procedures that we're going to follow when we do this QC. A little bit already about tool requirements and data and metric standards. We want to do that development work and setting the left and right boundaries before we even kick off this in phase 2. We want to start doing the groundwork and the strategizing beforehand, so that way what we're doing in phase 2 is purely on the validation side. We don't want to be building the plane as we're flying it. And in phase 2, when we kick off, this is going to be really validation. All the work has already been done, maybe a couple tweaks here and there. And then what we're going to do is, as we complete validation, we will have in hand an authority to operate. If we don't have authority to operate, then that means that we must have missed a mark somewhere and we're failed the validation. But even in those circumstances, we know we're going to learn a lot, and we don't believe at this point that that a failure to achieve an authority to operate is likely. We have had conversations with the NAO, FAO, and a variety of other, and we believe that we are on the right track, but there are details still to be had. Next thing is the quantitative cyber risk assessment report. This is going to be just a wrap-up of all of the efforts that we did for this particular Pathfinder, and then that'll enable any future Pathfinders to be able to follow along. And then the final report, which is going to be just a little bit bigger in scope, and that's going to be feeding into a lot of the bigger picture Navy strategies and other kinds of big movements, and abstracting that out and pushing that specifically with that final report back up to senior leaders for their final closeout brief. And so to kind of wrap up here, what we're looking at is the initiative overview. We're going to leverage existing efforts to the greatest extent possible. If anything that we've been talking about here sounds familiar to you, that's not by chance. The goal here is not to scrap everything and start all over from scratch. What we want to do is validate instead of create. It's already being done. We want to consolidate all of the good ideas, all the lessons learned from across all of the different Navy SysComs, across the DoDs, and any different stakeholders as we can find, bring them all in together into a common forum, come up with what we believe the best answer is, validate it, and then shift that and put it into policy. And that is why OpNav is pushing for this, right? We are looking to change policy, change the way that we do business at the echelon level. So we have the 2 primary focus areas. We talked about the tracks before. Now we're going to be looking at specifically 2 primary tracks, and then the other 3 tracks are going to be very important for discussion. But these 2 tracks really tie back into some of those deliverables we talked about before. The first track is going to be the science aspect. Fundamentally, what does a quantitative cyber risk assessment look like? And then the second track is going to be what does a continuous or agile approach look like when we start talking about the quantitative cyber risk assessment? How do I apply that science? And so really when you look at RMF, and again, so this is all of this coming straight from the NIST special pubs, we understand that when the RMF was created, we didn't have all of the answers. There needs to be a way that we can be a little bit more agile as we execute this process, but at the same time, this isn't anarchy. We need to have a way that we can make sense of it, we can have repeatability, we can have accountability, and so as we're looking forward, even though the original intent is to push for and allow for agile approaches, we do still need to figure out and work out the kinks about what guidance we're going to be giving out to the S2 and below, those of you who are actually implementing this process. And we're not going to be able to figure that until we actually do the Pathfinder, which is really what this is all about. And so I will leave you with the schedule here. So we did start on the 26th with a QCRA update, which was what you're listening to now. What we don't have included on this video is the Agile Risk Model, that's that track 2, or the Intro to Quantitative Risk, that's the track 1. But we will be moving forward with the QCRA Fundamentals Deep Dive, that's going to be on 23 April at 1400. That will be videotaped as well, and then following up with another deep dive, and then moving on into May. So if you have any other questions or want to get involved, please do take a look at our SharePoint page there down below, and the unofficial URL shortener there, which will help you to do that from memory. So if you do have any other questions, my contact information is on the front slide and also on the page that you're watching this video at. Thank you, and I look forward to having you involved.